A woman tries to keep up her routine while carrying a silent weight inside her home. At first, it all just seems like exhaustion and the small tensions of daily life. But an unexpected act shatters any illusion of normality. That night, she realizes her life will never be the same again. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The December night in Chicago arrived with that characteristic biting cold, the kind of temperature that makes people retreat indoors earlier, light their fireplaces, and seek the comfort of heavy blankets. The streets of the Lincoln Park neighborhood were decorated with simple Christmas lights, the kind that blink in an irregular rhythm in house windows, while some families were already having their holiday parties, gathering relatives who had come from far away. Megan Miller never imagined her life would come to this. At 32, 6 months pregnant, and the mother of a 3-year-old boy, she found herself in a situation she never thought possible. Not for her, who had always been seen as strong, determined, capable of handling any challenge. With a degree in business administration, she'd been working for years at a logistics company downtown, respected by her colleagues and known for her competence and dedication. But Megan's life began to change when she met Ryan Peterson 3 years earlier at a corporate event in River North. He was handsome, had an easy smile, and was a captivating conversationalist. He worked as a sales manager at a distribution company and seemed to have everything under control. In the first few months, everything was so perfect that Megan allowed herself to dream of a stable future, of a family built on love and partnership. What she didn't notice, or perhaps chose not to notice, were the small signs that began to appear soon after the wedding. Ryan had a complicated past. He came from a broken home, had grown up watching his father treat his mother with disrespect and harshness, and carried within him an unresolved anger that, from time to time, overflowed into outbursts of irritation and suspicion. At first, it was just comments, a remark about the outfit Megan wore to work, an uncomfortable question about a colleague who had liked one of her photos on social media, a query about why she needed to go out with her friends if she already had a family. Megan would laugh, thinking it was just jealousy, interpreting it as a twisted way of showing he cared. Then came the restrictions disguised as concern. Ryan started to think Megan's friends were a bad influence, that her family didn't respect her enough, that she needed to dedicate herself more to the house and less to her job. Little by little, Megan drifted away from the people she loved, believing she was prioritizing her marriage, protecting the peace of their home. When little Leo was born, Megan thought everything would change. Ryan was emotional during the delivery, cried as he held his son in his arms, and promised to be a present father and a better husband. And he was, for a few months. But the routine, the exhaustion, the sleepless nights, and the financial pressures brought back the old patterns. Control over their money was one of the first things to intensify. Ryan took over all the bills, saying it was so Megan wouldn't have to worry, so she could devote herself entirely to the baby. But in practice, this meant she had to ask for permission to buy anything, had to justify every expense, and had to listen to acidic comments about how she didn't know how to manage anything. Megan went back to work when Leo was 6 months old, but the pressure at home only increased. Ryan started questioning her hours, calling her repeatedly during the workday, demanding she send pictures to prove where she was. If she arrived 10 minutes late, there was an argument. If she didn't answer a call immediately, she was accused of hiding something. It was around this time that Jessica Moore entered Ryan's life. She was his co-worker, a 35-year-old divorcee with an impressive ability to read people's vulnerabilities and position herself exactly where she could have the most impact. Jessica quickly realized that Ryan was easily influenced, someone who sought constant validation and felt powerful when someone reinforced his insecurities and suspicions. She started slowly. Subtle comments during coffee breaks at work, seemingly innocent observations about how modern women no longer valued marriage, about how men needed to assert themselves to avoid being deceived. Ryan listened, absorbed it, and began to repeat the same ideas at home, as if they were his own reflections. Megan didn't know about Jessica's existence at that point. She only noticed that Ryan was becoming more distant, more irritable, more controlling. And then came the second pregnancy. It hadn't been planned, but Megan believed it could be an opportunity to reconnect, to renew their bond. When she told Ryan, he feigned joy, but there was something in his eyes she couldn't decipher. Fear, perhaps, or resentment. The following months were the hardest of Megan's life. The pregnancy brought intense morning sickness and extreme fatigue, and Ryan seemed less and less willing to help. He complained about everything, Leo's crying during the night, the food Megan prepared, the mess in the house. When she tried to talk, he would explode, yelling, slamming doors. Then came the silence, days on end, without speaking a word, ignoring Megan as if she were invisible. It was during this period that Megan began to notice Jessica's presence. Messages on Ryan's phone that appeared on the lock screen, conversations he would abruptly end when she entered the room, calls he would take locked in the bathroom. When Megan questioned him, he accused her of being crazy, paranoid, of making things up because of her pregnancy hormones. Megan began to doubt herself. Maybe she really was overreacting. Maybe the problem was her, that she couldn't be the wife Ryan deserved. She tried harder, tried to please him, avoided arguments, swallowed her tears, and pretended everything was fine. But things were not fine. And they were getting worse. Christmas had always been Megan's favorite time of year. Since she was a child, she loved the magic of the lights, the smell of pine, the sense of renewal that December brought. Even in the most difficult times, she insisted on keeping the traditions. She bought a small artificial tree, decorated it with ornaments she had saved from before the wedding, and set up a simple nativity scene on the living room shelf. Leo was enchanted. He would spend hours watching the lights blink, touching the colorful baubles, asking his mum to tell him the story of baby Jesus. Megan clung to those moments of purity, to her son's innocence, like an anchor to keep from sinking completely. Ryan, however, seemed annoyed by the decorations. He complained that the lights used too much electricity, that the tree took up space, that Megan was wasting money on nonsense. But she insisted. She needed it. She needed to believe there was still hope, that Christmas could bring some kind of change. In the week leading up to Christmas, Megan made a decision. She was going to leave. She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't keep living like this, walking on eggshells, afraid to breathe wrong and set off an explosion. She had to protect Leo, protect the baby growing inside her, protect herself. She began to prepare in secret. She put important documents in a folder hidden in the back of her closet, set aside a small amount of cash she had, managed to save over the months, and wrote a letter to Leo explaining in simple words that Mommy had to do something difficult, but it was for the love of him. Megan planned to leave on Christmas Eve while Ryan was at work. She would go to her father's house, Arthur Miller, a rigid and distant man she had barely spoken to in years. The relationship between them had never been easy. Arthur was a retired army colonel, someone who had always believed that showing affection was a sign of weakness, that raising a child with firmness was more important than hugging them. Megan grew up respecting her father, but never feeling truly loved by him. When Megan married Ryan, Arthur made it clear he didn't approve of the union, that the young man had no backbone, no character. Megan, hurt and proud, cut off contact. They hadn't spoken in almost 2 years. But now, with nowhere else to go, with no close friends because she had pushed them all away, Megan had no other choice. She needed her father, even if it meant swallowing her pride and admitting he had been right. But fate had other plans. On the night of December 23rd, Ryan came home more agitated than usual. Megan noticed it immediately. He had that look, that heavy breathing, that energy that foreshadowed a storm. She tried to stay calm, served dinner, put Leo to bed early, hoping the night would pass without incident. But Ryan started talking, about work, about how no one valued him, about how Megan didn't support him enough. She listened in silence, just nodding, trying to de-escalate, until he mentioned Jessica. It was a slip of the tongue. He was complaining about a boss and said that Jessica agreed with him, that she understood how unfairly he was treated. Megan's stomach turned. She couldn't take it. She asked who Jessica was, why he talked about her so much, what exactly was going on. The argument escalated quickly. Ryan yelled, accused Megan of being controlling, of not trusting him. She, for the first time in months, fought back. She said she was tired, that she couldn't take it anymore, that she was leaving. That's when everything spiraled out of control. Ryan grabbed her by the arm and dragged her into the backyard. Megan was barefoot, wearing only a thin nightgown and the Chicago. Cold that night was cruel. She tried to resist, but he was stronger. He locked the door leading inside, leaving Megan outside. Leo woke up with the noise and started crying. Megan could hear him through the glass of the window, see him banging on the door, calling for her. Desperation took over. She begged Ryan to open the door, promised she would stop arguing, that she would do whatever he wanted. But he just looked at her coldly and went to the bedroom, leaving Leo alone in the living room, crying. Megan knelt on the cold ground of the backyard, shivering, feeling light contractions begin to start. She didn't know if it was from the stress, the cold, or the panic, but something wasn't right. She tried to force the door, to scream for help, but the neighborhood was quiet, the houses shut tight, the families already settled in for the night. That's when she realized her hands were tied. Ryan had used a thin rope, tightening it around her wrists before pushing her outside. Megan hadn't even really noticed. It all happened so fast. Now alone, tied up, pregnant, and terrified of losing her baby, she understood the true gravity of the situation she was in. Are you enjoying this story? Tell me what you think of it and how you think it will end. Megan didn't know how long she had been out there. It could have been minutes or hours. The cold seeped into her bones, the contractions came in irregular waves, and Leo's cries from the other side of the window were like a knife twisting in her heart over and over. She tried to scream for help again, but her voice was weak, hoarse from all the pleading. That's when she heard footsteps outside the gate. David Chen was on his way home after a double shift at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. A nurse for 12 years, he was used to emergencies, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw in the early morning hours as he passed through the quiet Lincoln Park Street. A woman kneeling in a backyard, clearly pregnant, with her hands tied, shivering from the cold. David stopped immediately. His first instinct was to call the police, but something about the scene demanded faster action. He approached the gate, calling out softly so as not to startle the woman. Megan lifted her face, and David saw a desperation he recognized all too well. He had seen that expression before, in patients who arrived at the hospital with confusing stories, empty eyes, and bodies marked by situations no one should ever have to face. Megan asked for help in a broken voice. She begged him to get Leo out of the house, said the boy was alone, scared, that she couldn't get to him. David didn't hesitate. He hopped the low gate, helped Megan to her feet, and used a multi-tool he had in his backpack to cut the rope binding her wrists. But the house door was locked from the inside. David could see Leo through the window. The boy was sitting on the living room floor, hugging a teddy bear, sobbing. David tapped on the glass gently, waved at the boy, and tried to calm him with gestures. Leo looked at him with eyes swollen from crying. It was in that moment that David made a decision that would change everything. He took out his phone and photographed the scene. Not the woman directly, but the context, the situation, the evidence of what was happening there. Then he asked Megan if she had anyone she could call, someone she trusted. Megan almost said no, that she was alone, but then she remembered her father. She gave Arthur's number to David, quickly explaining that they hadn't spoken in years, but that maybe, just maybe, he could help. David sent the photo along with a short message explaining the situation and the location. On the other side of Chicago, in the Gold Coast neighborhood, Arthur Miller was awake. At 63, retired from his military career, he maintained the same rigid routine as always, even without any obligations. He woke up at 5, exercised, and had coffee alone in the kitchen of the large, empty house that had once been the family home. When his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, Arthur almost ignored it. But something made him open it. And then he saw the image. He recognized the backyard, recognized his daughter's silhouette even in the pre-dawn gloom, and something inside him shattered into a million pieces. Arthur had always considered himself a man of principle. He believed that firmness was the foundation of everything, that showing emotion was a sign of weakness. He raised Megan with that discipline, with clear rules. certain that he was preparing her to face a harsh world. When she married Ryan against his advice, Arthur took it as a personal affront. He said harsh things, words that couldn't be taken back, and Megan, proud like him, cut off contact. But seeing his daughter in that situation destroyed every barrier Arthur had built around his own heart. He understood, in a single terrible moment of clarity, that his rigidity had a price. That silence also hurt, that he had failed as a father by not reaching out, by not checking on his daughter, by letting pride speak louder than love. Arthur was out of the house in minutes. He drove through the still sleeping city with an urgency he hadn't felt in decades. He arrived at Megan's house to find David still there, trying to de-escalate the situation. Ryan had come out of the bedroom upon hearing voices, looking confused, trying to understand what was happening, alternating between trying to justify himself and blaming Megan for being dramatic. Arthur didn't argue. He simply walked in, scooped Leo into his arms, and led Megan to the car. The girl he had raised with such rigidity was now trembling in his arms, and Arthur felt a guilt so profound he could barely breathe. David followed them to the hospital, driving his own car behind Arthur's, making sure they arrived safely. In the emergency room at Northwestern Memorial, Megan was seen immediately. The contractions were real. The stress had triggered a risk of premature labor. The doctors acted quickly, administering medication to try to stop the process and monitoring the baby. Leo was taken to a children's waiting area, where a kind nurse distracted him with cartoons and a cup of hot chocolate. It was during those endless hours of waiting that Arthur began to talk to David. The nurse, who had seen so many similar situations, shared his own story. He told him about his younger sister, who had also been in a difficult relationship, about the signs the family had refused to see, about how society's silence allowed these situations to continue. Arthur listened in silence, absorbing every word like a blow to his conscience. He had always believed that being strong meant not showing vulnerability. But there, in that cold hospital hallway, he understood that true strength lay in admitting when you were wrong, in extending a hand, in being present. Megan was admitted for observation. She wouldn't have the baby that night, but she would need to be on complete bed rest for the next few days. She was sedated, finally resting after the trauma. Arthur sat by her bed, watching his daughter's face, seeing traces of the girl she had been, the woman she had become, and the invisible scars she carried. When Megan woke up, it was already daylight. Through the hospital room window, she could see the city's movement, people coming and going, life carrying on. Leo was asleep, in an armchair nearby, covered with a blanket someone had brought. And sitting in the other chair, with an expression Megan had never seen before, was her father. They looked at each other for a long moment. There weren't enough words to bridge years of distance, of hurt, of wounded pride. But there was something new in that look. Arthur took his daughter's hand, and for the first time in decades, he let tears stream freely down his face. Megan cried too, and in those tears there was release, pain, fear, but also the first spark of hope in the very long time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Ryan was facing his own consequences. The previous night had been a brutal awakening. Seeing strangers in his house, realizing there were witnesses, understanding the gravity of what he had done. He called Jessica, desperate, looking for validation, for someone to tell him he wasn't wrong. But Jessica, for the first time, didn't respond the way Ryan expected. She realized the situation had escalated too far, that there were real consequences now, and her self-preservation instinct kicked in. She told Ryan he needed to handle it himself, that she couldn't get involved, that maybe he really had gone too far. And she hung up. Ryan sat on the couch in the empty living room. The Christmas tree was still blinking its colorful lights, the nativity scene still on the shelf, but the house was silent in a way he had never experienced. For the first time, he found himself completely alone with his choices. At the hospital, Megan began to process what had happened. A hospital psychologist came to talk to her, offering support, explaining available resources, helping her understand that she wasn't alone. Megan discovered there was an entire network of people willing to help, from social workers to support groups for women in similar situations. One of those people was Sarah Davis, a nurse who worked on the same floor where Megan was admitted. Sarah was 42 and had her own story to tell. She had survived a destructive marriage 20 years earlier, when she was still very young. It took her years to rebuild, to trust again, to understand that what she had lived through did not define who she was. Sarah approached Megan with the gentleness of someone who knows another's pain. She didn't offer empty advice or cliches. She just sat by the bed, held her hand and said that she was stronger than she thought, that the road ahead would be difficult, but it was possible, that life on the other side of fear was worth every step of the journey. Megan absorbed every word like a dry plant soaking up water. She was beginning to understand that she had spent so much time focused on protecting others, on keeping the family together, on believing that love could fix everything, that she had forgotten to protect herself. She had forgotten that she mattered. On the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve, the hospital was decorated simply but meaningfully. A small artificial tree in the hallway, discreet lights, cards made by pediatric patients taped to the walls. Leo had spent the day exploring the hospital with Arthur, who discovered in his grandson a reason to smile that he hadn't experienced in years. Megan watched the two of them interact from her room's doorway. She saw the rigid grandfather transform before Leo's eyes, bending down to listen to the boy's stories, holding his small hand with a tenderness she had never seen. And in that there was also a pain, the awareness of what she had lost by growing up without that version of her father, but also gratitude that Leo was getting this chance. At night, when the hospital lights dimmed and only the monitors blinked softly, Megan lay awake. Leo was sleeping beside her in the bed, finally peaceful after all the trauma. Arthur had gone home to get clothes and belongings, promising to be back early the next morning. Through the window, Megan could see the distant lights of the city. Families celebrating, people gathered together. There was no holiday dinner. For her, no presents, no traditional idealized Christmas family. But there was something she hadn't had in a long time. Safety. The certainty that tonight she would sleep without fear. The guarantee that no one would hurt her, that no one would yell, that she could simply exist without walking on eggshells. Megan closed her eyes and, for the first time in months, felt a deep peace wash over her. There were still many battles ahead, many difficult decisions to make, many wounds to heal. But in that moment, on that Christmas night she would never forget, Megan understood that the first step to freedom had been taken, and that even in the middle of the storm it was still possible to find light. The days following Christmas were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations for Megan. She was discharged from the hospital on the condition of complete bed rest and weekly checkups. The baby was fine, but the risk remained. Arthur insisted that she and Leo stay at his house, and Megan, with no strength to resist and nowhere else to go, accepted. The house in the Gold Coast was too big for one person. Arthur had lived alone since his wife passed away years earlier, taking with her what little lightness remained in that home. The rooms were clean, organized with military precision, but devoid of life. Until Megan and Leo arrived. In the first few days, there was a silent tension between father and daughter. Polite conversations about basic needs, Leo's care, mealtimes. Nothing deep, nothing that touched on old wounds, but Leo, with the natural innocence of children, slowly began to break down those invisible walls. The boy followed his grandfather around the house, asking endless questions, begging to play, dragging Arthur out of the emotional comfort zone he had built over decades. And Arthur surprisingly allowed it. He found himself building with blocks on the living room floor, reading bedtime stories, preparing afternoon snacks. Simple things he had never done with his own daughter. Megan watched this with mixed feelings. There was joy in seeing Leo happy, in seeing her father transform. But there was also a deep sadness, a silent question that echoed in her mind. Why wasn't it like this for me? Why did I have to grow up with rigidity, in silence, at a distance? It was one afternoon while Leo was napping on the couch that Arthur finally initiated the conversation they had both been avoiding. He poured Megan a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and, for the first time in his life, spoke about his own fears. He told her about his difficult childhood, about an authoritarian father who saw affection as weakness, about how he joined the military, believing it was the way to become a real man. He spoke about his marriage to Megan's mother, about how he never knew how to express the love he felt, about how he thought providing financially was enough. Megan listened in silence, for the first time seeing her father not as an inflexible authority figure, but as a man who also carried his own unhealed wounds. It didn't erase the pain she had felt growing up. It didn't justify the years of emotional distance, but it offered a context, an understanding that was perhaps the first step toward healing. Arthur apologized, not with elaborate words or long speeches, but directly, looking his daughter in the eye. He said he had been wrong, that he should have been different, that if he could go back in time he would do everything differently, and that while he couldn't change the past, he was willing to try to build something new from now on. Megan cried. So did Arthur. And in those tears were years of resentment being washed away, of silences being broken, of a new relationship being slowly built on the rubble of the old one. Meanwhile, the world outside carried on. Ryan called Arthur's house every day. At first, the calls were aggressive, demanding that Megan come back, accusing her of abandonment, of turning Leo against him. Arthur would sometimes answer, his voice firm but controlled, making it clear that Megan was safe and would make her own decisions in her own time. But Ryan's calls began to change over the days. The aggression gave way to desperation, then to emotional manipulation, to promises of change, to pleas for forgiveness. Megan listened to the voicemails he left, and each one stirred her emotions in different ways. Part of her still remembered the man he had been at the beginning, the father he could be with Leo in the good moments. But another part, growing stronger every day, recognized the patterns she had ignored for so long. It was David who helped Megan see things more clearly. The nurse stayed in touch, checking on how she was doing, offering support. In one of their conversations, he showed Megan a cycle he knew well: tension, explosion, honeymoon, tension again. A pattern that repeated itself indefinitely, where promises of change were always followed by new episodes of control and aggression. Megan started attending a support group that Sarah had recommended. They were weekly meetings where women in similar situations shared their stories, their fears, their victories. There Megan discovered she wasn't alone, that her experiences weren't unique, that there was a name for what she had lived through, that there were paths to rebuilding. It was at one of these meetings that Megan first heard about systematic psychological manipulation, about how third parties could fuel conflicts in already fragile relationships. One of the women told her own story of how a co-worker of her ex-husband had deliberately planted seeds of doubt, twisted conversations, and created situations to cause fights. That lit a fire in Megan's mind. Jessica. She began to mentally replay the last few months, remembering how Ryan's worst outbursts often came after days when he mentioned talking to his co-worker. How his accusations seemed to echo specific phrases, ideas that didn't seem to be originally his. Megan decided to investigate. She asked an old friend who still worked near Ryan's company for help. The friend, discreetly, started asking questions, observing, gathering information, and what she discovered was disturbing. Jessica Moore had a history. It wasn't the first time she had gotten involved in colleagues' lives this way. There was a pattern to her behavior. Identify emotionally vulnerable men, usually in unstable relationships, get close by offering validation and understanding, then gradually fuel conflict and suspicion. What motivated Jessica wasn't exactly romantic interest in the men. It was more complex and disturbing than that. She derived satisfaction from having control, from being the one who knew the secrets, who influenced decisions, who had power over others' emotions. It was a form of manipulation that gave her a sense of importance she couldn't get in other ways. When Megan learned this, she felt a mix of anger and sadness. Anger for having been the target of this manipulation, for having seen her marriage eroded by an outsider, but also sadness for Ryan, who in his emotional fragility had become easy prey for that kind of influence. She decided to confront the situation head-on. She got Jessica's number through her friend and called. The conversation was tense, loaded with subtext and thinly veiled accusations. Jessica initially denied any involvement beyond a professional one, but when Megan mentioned she knew about other cases, that she had information, the mask began to crack. Jessica became defensive, then aggressive, accusing Megan of being paranoid, of looking for external culprits for her own marriage problems. But there was something in her tone, an urgency, a fear of being exposed, that confirmed Megan's suspicions. The conversation ended with no clear resolution, but Megan felt she had reclaimed something important. The understanding that she hadn't been crazy, she hadn't imagined things, she hadn't been inadequate. There had been an external force actively working to destroy what was already fragile. Meanwhile, Ryan was beginning to face his own truths. Alone in the empty house, without the constant validation from Jessica, who had completely distanced herself, he was forced to look at himself in a way he never had before. And what he saw wasn't pretty. He started to remember things he had pushed to the back of his mind. His childhood watching his father treat his mother with contempt, the years of accumulating frustrations without ever learning to process emotions in a healthy way, the times he had sworn to himself he would be different, only to repeat the same patterns. Ryan sought help, not out of altruism or sudden enlightenment, but because he was genuinely scared of what he had become, of what he had done. He started therapy, something he had always mocked as being for weak people. But there, in a psychologist's office in downtown Chicago, he had to face uncomfortable truths about himself. The therapist helped Ryan understand that real change didn't come from empty promises or moments of regret followed by relapses. It came from hard, constant work, from recognizing patterns, from learning new ways to deal with frustration and insecurity. And that even with all that work, it didn't guarantee that Megan would come back, nor that she should. Megan, for her part, was building her own healing journey. With the support of her father, the women's group David and Sarah, she slowly regained her self-confidence. She started doing things she had given up, reading, listening to music, talking to old friends she had pushed away. One of those friends was Emily, who had been her college roommate. When Emily heard about the situation, she showed up at Arthur's house with a bag of books, chocolates, and a tight hug. They spent the whole afternoon talking, reminiscing about who Megan had been before all this, reclaiming parts of her identity that had been buried under layers of fear and control. Megan's belly grew each week. The baby was healthy, moving a lot, reminding her that a new life was on the way, a new chance to do things differently. She began to plan for the future, not an idealized or perfect future, but a possible one. She thought about returning to work after the baby was born, about finding her own place for her and the kids, about rebuilding her independence. Leo, despite all the turmoil, showed impressive resilience. With a stable routine at his grandfather's house, with his mother more emotionally present, and with appropriate child therapy, he was beginning to process the trauma in a healthy way. He still had occasional nightmares, still asked about his dad, but he was visibly more secure, happier. January brought the typical heat of a Midwestern summer, even in Chicago. The city was slowly returning to its routine after the holidays. Megan was 7 months pregnant and starting to think concretely about the birth, about what it would be like to bring this new life into the world, about what kind of mother she wanted to be this time. It was during a prenatal appointment that Megan had an important conversation with her doctor, Dr. Elizabeth Reed. The doctor, an experienced woman in her 50s, noticed that Megan was carrying guilt, constantly questioning her choices, wondering if she had taken too long to leave, if she had exposed Leo to that situation. Dr. Reed held Megan's hands and said something that would stay with her forever. You did the best you could with the emotional resources you had at the time. Leaving a situation like that isn't simple. It's not a matter of willpower. It's a complex process, and you did it. That's not a small thing. That's huge. Megan cried in the doctor's office, but they were different tears, not of pain or despair, but of release. She was, finally, beginning to forgive herself. February arrived with that intense heat that makes the afternoons seem endless. Megan was 8 months pregnant, her belly large, her feet swollen, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. Arthur's house had been transformed. Where rigid silence once reigned, there were now Leo's laughs, conversations at the dinner table, soft music playing in the living room. It was on a Saturday afternoon that Ryan showed up at the door. Megan was alone with Leo. Arthur had gone out to run some errands at the bank. When the doorbell rang and she saw who it was through the peephole, her heart raced. But it was no longer the paralyzing fear of before. It was something different, an apprehension mixed with curiosity about who he was now, after nearly 2 months apart. Megan opened the door but stood firmly in the doorway. Ryan looked different, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, his hair slightly longer. He seemed smaller somehow, less imposing. He asked to talk, said he didn't want to force anything, he just needed to speak. Megan hesitated, but something inside her knew this conversation was necessary. She called her neighbor to watch Leo for a few minutes and went out into the garden with Ryan. They sat on a bench under the shade of an old tree, keeping a safe distance from each other. Ryan began to speak, and for the first time, Megan heard him take real responsibility, not the empty apologies she knew so well, followed by justifications and blaming others, but a genuine admission that he had failed, that he had become someone he himself despised, that he had hurt the people he was supposed to protect. He told her about therapy, about the difficult things he was discovering about himself, about the patterns he had inherited and never questioned. He talked about Jessica, finally admitting that she had manipulated his insecurities, that he had allowed it because it fed his ego to have someone validating his worst impulses. Megan listened to him with a detachment she hadn't had before. She could see Ryan now not through the lens of idealized love or paralyzing fear, but with a new clarity. She saw a broken man trying to rebuild himself, but she also saw all the times he had made promises before, all the times the cycle had repeated. When Ryan finished speaking, Megan took a deep breath and responded with an honesty she didn't know she possessed. She said she recognized his effort, that she hoped he would continue the work of changing himself, but that didn't mean she would come back, that it didn't mean they could be a family again in the way he might be hoping. She explained that she had spent too much time believing her love could heal him, that her staying could change him, that her patience would be rewarded, and that she now understood that each person is responsible for their own healing, that she couldn't carry someone else's emotional weight on her. Back, not when she had 2 children to raise, not when she had her own life to rebuild. Ryan listened in silence, and Megan saw tears stream down his face. But she didn't give in, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, out of the self-love she was learning to cultivate. She said he could have a relationship with his children, that she wouldn't stop him, but it would have to be on her terms, with clear boundaries, with guaranteed safety. Ryan nodded, defeated but seemingly understanding. He stood up to leave, but before he did, he turned and asked, "One last question. Could she ever forgive him?" Megan thought carefully before answering. She said that maybe, with time, she could forgive, not for him, but for herself, so she could move on without carrying the weight of resentment. But that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean going back. After Ryan left, Megan sat in the garden for a long time. She felt the tears come, but they were tears of liberation. She had looked into the eyes of the man who once terrorized her and held her truth. She hadn't given in, hadn't backed down, hadn't put his feelings above her own. That was power. That was growth. The following weeks were spent preparing for the baby's arrival. Megan set up a simple nursery in Arthur's house, who insisted she and the children stay as long as needed. The relationship between father and daughter continued to deepen, layers of resentment being replaced by understanding and gradually by a new and genuine affection. Leo was excited about the idea of being a big brother. He helped pick out clothes, talked to his mum's belly, and drew pictures to decorate the baby's room. His innocence was a constant reminder to Megan of why it had all been worth it. In March, on a warm autumn morning, Megan felt the first real contractions. Arthur drove her to the hospital with Leo in the back seat, humming children's songs, completely oblivious to the tension of the moment. At the hospital, Megan was greeted by the staff with the familiarity of people who already knew her story. David was on shift that day. a coincidence that felt almost like a gift from fate. The labor was long but went smoothly, and when Megan finally held her daughter in her arms, a small perfect girl with a strong, healthy cry, she felt something complete itself within her. She named her Sophia, which meant wisdom. A wisdom hard-won, paid for, with the high price of pain and fear. Arthur came into the room with Leo, and the boy was mesmerized when he saw his little sister. He asked to hold her, and Megan carefully helped him. Leo looked at Sophia's tiny face with a tenderness that broke Megan's heart in the best possible way. Arthur watched the scene with tears in his eyes, this man who once believed that crying was a weakness. Megan spent 3 days in the hospital before being discharged. They were days of adaptation, of learning, of adjustments. Sarah stopped by to visit, bringing flowers and words of encouragement. Emily showed up with a suitcase full of baby clothes. The support group sent a beautiful basket with messages from all the women, and Ryan came too. He asked for permission first, respected the visiting hours Megan set, and kept an appropriate distance. When he held Sophia for the first time, Megan saw something change in his eyes. She didn't know if it would be enough for a real, lasting transformation, but there was a glimpse of possibility. Maybe not for them as a couple, but maybe for him as a father, as a person. The following months were about adjusting to the new routine. Sleepless nights with Sophia, Leo needing attention, Megan gradually returning to work part-time. Arthur proved to be a surprisingly involved grandfather, waking up in the middle of the night to help with the baby, playing on the floor with Leo, cooking simple but heartfelt dinners. Megan started looking for her own place, not out of a lack of gratitude for her father's hospitality, but because she needed it. She needed a space that was hers, that she could build from scratch, free of bad memories, free of external control. She found a small apartment in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, not far from Arthur's house. 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a balcony where she could put plants. It was a significant financial effort, but Megan was determined. She used her savings, accepted help from her father, who insisted on contributing, and made careful plans. When she finally got the keys to the apartment, she felt an emotion that was hard to describe. This space was hers, truly hers. The move happened on a sunny Saturday in September. Arthur helped with the furniture, Emily came to help organize the kitchen, and David and Sarah showed up with plants and a homemade cake. The apartment slowly took shape, each object placed with intention, each corner designed to be welcoming and safe. When everyone had gone, and Megan was alone with the children on that first night in the new apartment, she sat on the living room couch and just breathed. Leo was asleep in his room, Sophia in her bassinet next to Megan's bed. The city, lights shone through the balcony window. Megan thought about everything she had been through, how less than a year ago she had been tied up in her backyard, pregnant and terrified, thinking she wouldn't survive the night. And now here she was, in her own home with her children safe, rebuilding her life piece by piece. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days. There was still residual fear. There were still scars that ached at unexpected moments. But there was also strength, there was growth, there was hope, and above all there was freedom. December came again, bringing with it the Christmas decorations, the spirit of renewal, the promise of new beginnings. Megan decorated the apartment simply but meaningfully. A small tree in the living room, gently blinking lights, a nativity scene that Leo helped set up. But now, unlike the year before, those lights didn't hide any shadows. They illuminated a true home. On Christmas Eve, Megan prepared a simple dinner. Arthur came over with a pie he had made himself, a clumsy first attempt, but full of meaning. Emily showed up with a small turkey. David and Sarah stopped by quickly to drop off presents for the kids. The table was small with only 4 chairs, but gathered around it was something more valuable than any lavish feast, a reconstructed family. Arthur held Sophia in his lap, while Megan helped Leo serve the food. They talked about the year that had passed, about plans for the next one, about the good memories they were creating together. After dinner, Megan put the children to bed. Leo wanted to hear the story of the birth of Jesus, and Megan told it in a soft voice, adapting the details for his understanding. When he finally fell asleep, she spent a few minutes just watching her son sleep peacefully, safe and loved. Back in the living room, she found Arthur on the balcony, looking out at the city. Megan joined him, and they stood in comfortable silence for a few moments. Then Arthur spoke, his voice thick with emotion, saying he was grateful. Grateful for a second chance, for getting to know his grandchildren, for finally having a real relationship with his daughter. He said she was the strongest person he knew. Megan rested her head on her father's shoulder, and there in that simple moment she felt she had come, full circle. The previous Christmas had been rock bottom, the darkest moment, but it had also been the turning point, the moment she decided she deserved more, that her children deserved more. There was no fairy tale ending. Ryan hadn't transformed into Prince Charming, and Megan hadn't found a new love to fix all her wounds. But there was something more powerful than that. There was self-reconstruction, there was reclaimed dignity, there was the profound certainty that she was capable of sustaining her own life. The lights on the Christmas tree blinked softly in the living room, reflecting in the balcony window. Megan looked at them and smiled. They were just lights, plastic and electricity, but to her they represented so much more. They represented hope. They represented rebirth. They represented the truth that even the coldest nights can give way to new mornings. Megan Miller was no longer the woman she had been. She carried scars, yes, but she also carried wisdom. She was afraid sometimes, but she also had courage. She had lost so much, but she had gained something priceless, herself. And as the city of Chicago fell asleep on that Christmas night, Megan went inside, closed the door and felt for the first time in years that she was truly home. Not just in a physical space, but within her own skin. And that was a gift no one could ever take from her. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Megan's story and her journey of reconstruction have deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this narrative of overcoming and rebirth, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most, or if you know someone who also found the strength to start over. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and show that even in the darkest nights, there is the possibility of a new dawn. Megan's story teaches us that true love should never hurt, that asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness, and that there is always hope, even when all seems lost. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on the complexity of life and human relationships.